Water is the most familiar substance in your life. It fills more than half of your body. It falls from the sky. It runs through every river and ocean and groundwater system on the planet. It is the medium within which every biological process you depend on actually occurs. And yet, when modern chemistry and physics examine water carefully, it turns out to be one of the strangest substances in the known universe. By every comparative standard, water should not behave the way it does. It should freeze at a different temperature. It should boil at a different temperature. It should have a different density profile across temperature changes. It should have different surface properties, different solvent properties, different thermal properties from the ones it actually exhibits. The simple chemical formula H2O suggests a substance that should be entirely ordinary, similar to other small molecules like methane or hydrogen sulfide. But water is not ordinary. Water has, by the most current count, more than 70 known properties that deviate from what comparable molecules would lead chemists to predict. These deviations are not minor curiosities. They are, in many cases, the very features that make life on Earth possible. And the more carefully scientists examine water, the stranger it becomes, in ways that bear directly on the deepest questions about why this particular molecule, almost alone among the substances of the universe, has the specific properties that allow biology to exist. This is the first inquiry in a series that will examine what water actually is, what its strange behavior implies for the nature of life, and what the world's contemplative traditions have understood about water through entirely different methods. The science of water has been developing for more than 3 centuries, and the contemplative literature on water extends back to the earliest written religious texts. Both bodies of inquiry, when examined together, reveal a substance whose ordinariness in everyday experience disguises a complexity that has not yet been fully understood by any scientific framework currently available. The familiar liquid that you drink and bathe in is, at its molecular level, a substrate of activity whose specific features are arguably the deepest single fact about why biology exists on this planet at all. The story of how chemistry came to understand water begins, in its modern form, with the work of Linus Pauling at the California Institute of Technology in the 1930s. Pauling, who would go on to win 2 Nobel Prizes, was the first chemist to develop a comprehensive theoretical framework for chemical bonding based on quantum mechanics. His 1939 book, The Nature of the Chemical Bond, which has been called one of the most influential chemistry texts of the 20th century, established the conceptual vocabulary that chemists still use to describe how atoms hold together to form molecules. And it was Pauling who first articulated, with the precision that quantum mechanics made possible, what came to be called the hydrogen bond. The hydrogen bond is the key to understanding water's strangeness. In a water molecule, 2 hydrogen atoms are connected to a single oxygen atom by what chemists call covalent bonds, in which the atoms share electrons. The geometry of the molecule is bent rather than linear, with the 2 hydrogen atoms positioned at an angle of about 104 degrees from each other relative to the oxygen. The oxygen atom is more electronegative than the hydrogens, meaning that it pulls the shared electrons toward itself more strongly. This creates a separation of charge across the molecule, with the oxygen end becoming slightly negative and the hydrogen ends becoming slightly positive. The molecule, as a whole, is electrically polar, and this polarity sets the stage for what happens when many water molecules come together in liquid water. When water molecules are in close proximity, the slightly positive hydrogen of one molecule is attracted to the slightly negative oxygen of another. This attraction is the hydrogen bond, and it is much stronger than the ordinary van der Waals interactions that hold most molecular liquids together. Each water molecule can form up to 4 hydrogen bonds simultaneously, 2 through its oxygen accepting hydrogens from other molecules, and 2 through its hydrogens donating to oxygens of other molecules. The result is a vast network of interlinked molecules, each one connected to its neighbors through these specific directional bonds, forming a structured liquid that is qualitatively different from anything else in chemistry. Most molecular liquids are simple collections of molecules bouncing around with relatively weak interactions. Water is not a simple collection of molecules. Water is a network, and the network has properties that the individual molecules, considered separately, do not have at all. The implications of this network structure are far-reaching. The hydrogen bond network is what gives water its high boiling point relative to other small molecules of comparable mass. Methane, with a molecular mass close to water's, boils at minus 161 degrees Celsius. Hydrogen sulfide, water's closest chemical analogue, boils at minus 60 degrees Celsius. Water, by all the trends that comparable molecules establish, should boil at something around minus 80 degrees Celsius. Instead, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. The difference of nearly 200 degrees is entirely the result of the energy required to break the hydrogen bond network when liquid water transitions to vapor. Without the hydrogen bonds, water would be a gas at every temperature found on the surface of the Earth. There would be no oceans, there would be no rain. There would be no liquid medium for biological chemistry. Life as we know it could not exist. This is only the first of water's many anomalies. The most famous, and perhaps the most consequential for the existence of life, is the density anomaly. In almost every other substance known to chemistry, the solid form is denser than the liquid form, because in the solid state the molecules are packed more closely together. Ice, however, is less dense than liquid water. This is why ice floats. The reason involves the geometry of the hydrogen bond network. In ice, the water molecules are arranged in a specific crystalline pattern, in which each molecule maintains 4 hydrogen bonds with its neighbors at fixed angles. This pattern is more open than the arrangement in liquid water, where the bonds are constantly forming and breaking and the molecules can pack more closely together on average. The crystal structure of ice has more empty space than liquid water, which makes it less dense. The consequences for life are profound. When a lake freezes in winter, the ice forms at the surface and stays at the surface, insulating the liquid water below. The fish and other organisms in the lake survive the winter in the liquid water beneath the ice. If ice were denser than liquid water, ice would form at the bottom of the lake and gradually fill the lake from the bottom up, freezing solid all the way through over the course of a sufficiently cold winter. There would be no surviving aquatic life through cold winters in any temperate climate. The history of life on Earth would have been radically different, and probably much shorter, if water had the ordinary density behavior that other liquids have. The fact that ice floats is one of the small physical facts on which the entire elaboration of life depends. The density anomaly extends beyond the simple fact that ice floats. Liquid water itself has an unusual density profile across temperature. Most liquids, when warmed, expand uniformly, becoming less dense as their molecules move more energetically and take up more space on average. Liquid water does this above 4 degrees Celsius. But below 4 degrees, water reverses the trend. As liquid water cools from 4 degrees towards 0, it becomes less dense rather than more dense. The maximum density of liquid water is therefore at 4 degrees Celsius, not at the freezing point as one might naively expect. This anomaly has consequences for ocean and lake chemistry, for the mixing of water layers, and for the conditions in which biology can operate. The 4-degree maximum density is one of the small physical facts that shapes the entire ecology of bodies of water on Earth. A third anomaly involves what is called specific heat capacity, the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of a substance by 1 degree. Water has an extraordinarily high specific heat capacity compared to other liquids. To raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius requires about 4.19 joules of energy. To raise the temperature of 1 gram of ethanol by the same amount requires only about 2.46 joules. The difference is again the result of the hydrogen bond network. Adding energy to liquid water does not just speed up the molecules, it also rearranges the hydrogen bonds, which absorbs energy without producing a temperature increase. The temperature only rises after the molecular kinetic energy has saturated within the constraints of the hydrogen bond network. The result is that water resists temperature change far more than most liquids. Oceans, lakes, and the water in living organisms all act as thermal buffers, absorbing and releasing heat slowly enough to stabilize the environment. The high specific heat of water is one of the conditions that makes the climate of Earth habitable, and it is one of the conditions that allows the bodies of warm-blooded organisms to maintain stable internal temperatures despite changes in their external environment. Water's surface tension is also anomalously high. Surface tension is the force that holds the surface of a liquid together, allowing some insects to walk on water and producing the characteristic dome shape of a drop on a flat surface. Water's surface tension is among the highest of any common liquid, exceeded only by mercury and a few other unusual substances. The hydrogen bond network is again responsible. The molecules at the surface of water are pulled inward by the hydrogen bonds connecting them to molecules below, while having no corresponding hydrogen bonds pulling them outward into the air. The asymmetry produces the high surface tension. The biological consequences include the capillary action that draws water up through the roots of plants and through the smallest blood vessels of animals. Without the high surface tension of water, the circulatory systems of plants and animals would have to operate on entirely different physical principles. The vascular systems of every multicellular organism on Earth depend on the specific surface properties of water. Water is also the most universal solvent known to chemistry. More substances dissolve in water than in any other common liquid. The reason, again, traces back to the polar nature of the water molecule and the hydrogen bond network. Polar molecules and ionic compounds are pulled apart and surrounded by water molecules, which use their charges to interact with the dissolved species. The result is that water can carry an enormous variety of substances in solution, allowing the complex chemistry of biology to proceed in aqueous environments. Every metabolic reaction in your body, every neurotransmitter signaling event, every digestive process, every immune response, occurs in water and depends on water's solvent properties. Without these properties, biological chemistry as we know it could not function. Beyond these well-known anomalies, water exhibits dozens of more subtle and less commonly discussed deviations from what theory predicts. Martin Chaplin, a chemist at London South Bank University, has maintained for years a comprehensive academic catalogue of water's anomalies on his Water Structure and Science website, where he lists more than 70 distinct properties in which water deviates significantly from the behaviour of comparable substances. The list includes specific anomalies in compressibility, viscosity, thermal conductivity, dielectric constant, and many other physical and chemical properties. Some of the anomalies are well understood and traced to the hydrogen bond network. Others remain matters of active research, with chemists continuing to debate the precise molecular dynamics that produce the observed behaviour. What is not in doubt is that water is, by every quantitative measure available, an unusual substance. A few additional anomalies deserve specific mention because of their direct biological consequences. Water has an extraordinarily high dielectric constant, meaning that it dramatically reduces the electrical force between charged particles dissolved within it. Sodium and chloride ions in seawater, for example, attract each other much less strongly when surrounded by water than they would in a vacuum or in most other solvents. This is why salt dissolves so readily in water, rather than remaining as a crystal. The high dielectric constant is essential for the chemistry of life. The proteins, nucleic acids, and other charged biological molecules can fold, interact, and function in water precisely because the dielectric properties of water moderate the electrical forces between charged sites. In a solvent with a lower dielectric constant, the electrical interactions among biological molecules would be too strong for the delicate folding and conformational changes that proteins use to do their work. Life's molecular machines depend on water's specific electrical properties for the very possibility of their operation. Water also exhibits unusual behavior under compression. Most liquids become more viscous when compressed, as the molecules are forced into closer proximity and have less room to move past each other. Liquid water shows the opposite behavior over certain pressure ranges. Compressing water actually decreases its viscosity, allowing it to flow more easily under pressure than at lower pressures. This is the result of compression disrupting the hydrogen bond network, breaking some of the directional bonds and freeing the molecules to move more independently. The biological consequences are subtle but real. The water in deep ocean trenches, in deep aquifers, and in the high-pressure environments that exist within biological tissues all has slightly different properties from the water in atmospheric conditions, and these differences play roles in how chemistry and biology operate in those environments. The thermal conductivity of water is also higher than what comparable molecules would predict, again because of the hydrogen bond network. Heat propagates through liquid water by passing energy from one hydrogen-bonded molecule to the next, a more efficient mechanism than the simple molecular collisions that transport heat through other liquids. The high thermal conductivity contributes to water's role as a thermal buffer in environments and organisms, allowing rapid distribution of heat to prevent local temperature extremes. Without this property, the metabolism of warm-blooded organisms would have to operate differently, and the distribution of heat in oceans and atmospheres would produce different climates than the ones the Earth actually has. The work of Felix Franks, the British chemist who spent his career studying water, codified much of the modern understanding of water's strangeness. Franks edited a multi-volume reference work titled Water, a Comprehensive Treatise, published across the 1970s and 1980s, which collected the state of knowledge about water across the various subfields of chemistry, physics, and biology. The treatise made clear that water, despite being the most studied substance in chemistry, was also among the least understood, in the sense that no single theoretical framework was capable of accounting for all its anomalies. The molecular structure of water was understood, the hydrogen bond was understood, but the cooperative behavior of vast populations of water molecules interacting through the dense network of constantly forming and breaking hydrogen bonds produced emergent properties whose detailed prediction remained difficult even with the most powerful computational tools available. This difficulty is not diminished with time. Decades of subsequent research, including extensive computational simulations of water at the molecular level, have refined our understanding of specific water phenomena, but have not produced a complete unified theory of water's behavior. The most accurate computational models of water still rely on empirical parameters tuned to match experimental observations, rather than deriving water's properties entirely from first principles. The reasons are, in part, simply that water is computationally challenging. The hydrogen bond network involves long-range cooperative interactions that are difficult to capture in simulations of finite size, but the difficulty also reflects something genuine about the substance itself. Water's behavior emerges from the coordinated activity of enormous numbers of molecules, forming and breaking bonds on timescales that range from femtoseconds to picoseconds, and the complexity of this coordinated activity exceeds what any simple description can fully capture. What makes the strangeness of water particularly arresting when its full extent is appreciated is how directly it bears on the existence of life. Almost every one of water's anomalies turns out to be, on close examination, exactly what life requires. Life requires a liquid medium that remains liquid across the temperature range that biology operates in, which water provides through its anomalously high boiling point. Life requires that aquatic ecosystems survive winter freezing, which water provides through the floating of ice. Life requires thermal stability in environments and organisms, which water provides through its high specific heat capacity. Life requires a universal solvent that can carry the diverse chemistry of biological molecules, which water provides through its solvent properties. Life requires capillary action for circulation systems, which water provides through its high surface tension. The list goes on. Each anomaly that makes water strange chemically is, biologically, a feature that the existence of complex life depends on. The same substance considered from the standpoint of physical chemistry looks like an unusual molecule with surprising deviations from typical behavior. Considered from the standpoint of biology, the same substance looks like a liquid specifically suited to support the structures and processes of living organisms. This convergence has been called, by various scientists who have reflected on it, the Goldilocks paradox of water. The phrase comes from the children's story in which a young girl finds porridge that is not too hot and not too cold, but just right. Water, similarly, has properties that are not too extreme in any direction but exactly right for biology. The temperature range of liquid water matches the range biology operates in. The thermal capacity of water matches the buffering biology needs. The solvent properties match the chemistry biology deploys. The surface properties match the structures biology builds. Each match could be coincidence. The accumulation of matches across so many independent properties is, on the most natural reading, suspicious. Either life evolved to take advantage of water's specific features, which is partly true but does not fully account for the convergence, or water's specific features are, in some deeper sense, oriented toward the kind of complexity that life represents. The question of how to read this convergence has been debated by chemists, biologists, and philosophers for as long as the convergence has been recognized. There is no consensus answer. What there is, beyond reasonable dispute, is the observation that water and life fit each other in ways that exceed what mere coincidence would lead us to expect. The most extensive early articulation of this observation was made by the American biochemist Lawrence Henderson, who taught at Harvard University in the early 20th century. Henderson's 1913 book, The Fitness of the Environment, argued in detail that the physical and chemical properties of water, along with those of carbon dioxide and a few other substances, exhibited a degree of fitness for the elaboration of life that he found difficult to explain as mere coincidence. Henderson did not draw any explicit theological conclusions from this observation. He was a working scientist, and his book is a scientific argument rather than a religious one. But the argument he developed, that the specific physical features of the matter and energy available on Earth seem to be specifically suitable for the kind of complex chemistry that biology represents, has been a touchstone for subsequent reflection on the relationship between physical conditions and biological possibility. The argument was rediscovered and developed in different vocabulary by various 20th century thinkers, and it remains a serious topic in the philosophy of biology and the philosophy of physics. Whether the fitness Henderson identified represents a deep feature of reality or simply a feature of the particular planet we happen to live on remains contested. But the fitness itself, as a matter of empirical observation, is not contested. Water really is, by every measure that has been applied, suitable for life in ways that no other liquid we know of is. The most thoughtful scientific reflection on this convergence comes from the British science writer and chemist Philip Ball, whose 1999 book, H2O, a biography of water, and his many subsequent writings have argued for a careful position on what water's strangeness implies. Ball's view, defended across his career, is that water is genuinely unusual, but not miraculous. The anomalies are real and significant, but they can be accounted for in terms of the physics and chemistry of the hydrogen bond network without invoking any additional principles. The Goldilocks fit between water and life, on Ball's analysis, reflects the fact that life evolved on a planet where water happened to be available, and that life's chemistry adapted to the specific properties of the available solvent. The fit is not coincidence in the sense of being random. The fit is the result of evolutionary adaptation operating on the specific resources that the planet provided. Ball's careful position is widely respected within the scientific community, and it represents the most intellectually responsible reading of what water's anomalies imply. At the same time, even on Ball's careful reading, the strangeness of water remains striking. The fact that the molecule whose anomalies happen to be exactly suitable for life is also the molecule that evolutionary processes happen to find on this particular planet is itself a fact worth contemplating. The chain of contingencies that led to the existence of any life at all on Earth, including the geochemical conditions that made liquid water available, the specific molecular properties that allowed the first complex chemistry to occur, and the evolutionary developments that led from simple chemistry to elaborate biology, is a chain whose specific features depend at every step on the detailed properties of water. Other liquids exist in the universe. Liquid methane, liquid nitrogen, liquid ammonia all occur in various extraterrestrial environments. None of them has the combination of properties that water has. None of them has been observed to support anything resembling biology. The specificity of water to the kind of complex chemistry that biology represents is a fact that neither requires nor permits a simple causal explanation. It is part of what makes our planet what it is, and what makes our existence possible at all. What this means for understanding water in the broader context of physical reality is that water is not just any liquid that biology happens to use. Water is a specific substance whose properties seem to be intricately suited to the elaboration of complex biological chemistry, and whose strangeness as a chemical substance is precisely what makes it suitable. The next inquiry in this series will examine more recent and more provocative scientific work on water, including the question of whether water in living systems has structural features that go beyond what bulk water in laboratory glassware exhibits. We will examine the work that Gerald Pollack has done on what he calls the fourth phase of water, structured zones near hydrophilic surfaces that may have properties distinct from ordinary liquid water. We will also examine the developing field of quantum biology, which has begun to investigate whether quantum mechanical effects play roles in biological water that have not been recognized in earlier frameworks. The picture that emerges from this newer work is contested, and we will be careful about distinguishing what is established from what remains speculative. But the picture is also striking, and it bears directly on the question of why the molecule that fills more than half of your body has the deep features it does. For now, what can be said with confidence is that water, the most familiar substance in human life, is also one of the most genuinely strange substances in the universe of known chemistry. Its anomalies are well documented, its connection to the existence of life is intimate and pervasive, its detailed molecular dynamics remain a subject of active research even after centuries of investigation. And the question of what water actually is, when considered in its full molecular and biological context, is a question that has occupied thoughtful scientists across the modern era, and that has, in different vocabulary, occupied contemplative traditions across all of recorded history. Long before any laboratory could measure the hydrogen bond network or characterize the anomalies of liquid water, contemplative traditions in widely separated cultures recognized something special about water and accorded it a place in their cosmologies and religious practices that no other substance occupied. The opening of the Hebrew Bible, in the second verse of the book of Genesis, describes the primordial state of creation in language that placed water at the center of the cosmic origin. Before there was any distinguishable form in the world, the verse states, the Spirit of God moved over the face of the waters. Water, in this articulation, was prior to the differentiated cosmos. The world emerged from the waters, organized by the divine activity that hovered over them. The image is striking, and it is shared, in different forms, with the creation narratives of many other ancient traditions. Babylonian cosmology placed primordial waters at the origin of the world. Egyptian cosmology placed the primordial waters of none before any other element. Vedic Hindu cosmology placed the primordial waters as the substrate from which the cosmic order emerged. The convergence across these independent traditions, each placing water at the very beginning of cosmic existence, is itself a fact worth taking seriously. Water, on the universal testimony of these ancient cosmologies, was not just one element among others. Water was the substrate from which the differentiated world arose. The Quranic tradition articulates this insight with particular directness. The 30th verse of the 21st chapter states that God has made every living thing from water. The Arabic phrase وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ has been the basis for centuries of Islamic theological reflection on the relationship between water and life. The verse does not say that water is one of the things from which living things are made. The verse says that every living thing is made from water. The claim is comprehensive. And it has, when read alongside the modern biological understanding of water as the medium of every cellular process, a directness that ordinary scientific intuition does not always associate with religious literature. The Quranic articulation captures, in one sentence, the essential biological fact that life, as it actually exists, is constitutively aqueous. Every cell that has ever lived has been a vessel of structured water. Every metabolic process has occurred in water. Every transmission of biological information, from DNA replication to neural signaling, has occurred in water. The Quranic claim is not metaphorical. The claim is, by the standards of modern biology, literally true. These traditions, which we will examine in detail in our third inquiry, did not arrive at their insights through molecular spectroscopy or quantum mechanical analysis of hydrogen bonds. They arrived through sustained attention to the role of water in the natural world, in human life, and in the rituals and practices that those traditions developed for engaging with what they took to be most sacred. What they found, in their own different vocabularies, was that water occupied a position in the order of being that no other substance occupied. Water was the medium of life. Water was the agent of cleansing and renewal. Water was the symbol of, and in some traditions the actual instrument of, divine activity in the world. The convergence between these traditional recognitions and the modern scientific understanding of water as the unique medium of biological complexity is, when both bodies of inquiry are taken seriously, one of the more remarkable convergences in the history of human thought. We will be working out the implications of this convergence across the inquiries to come. But first, we have to go further into the science itself. We have to examine what the latest research on water has uncovered about how water behaves in living systems, where it interacts with the complex organic molecules that constitute biology in ways that may differ from how it behaves in bulk laboratory samples. We have to consider the contested but serious work on structured water and the role of water in quantum biology. And we have to ask what these developments imply for the question of why water, of all possible liquids in the universe, happens to be the one that life arose in. These are the questions the next inquiry will pursue. The strangeness of water is not just an interesting fact about chemistry. The strangeness of water is, in some sense, the inquiries are still working to articulate the most fundamental fact about why biology exists at all. The water in your body is not the same as the water in a glass on a laboratory bench. This is not a mystical claim. It is a chemical observation that has become increasingly clear as biochemistry has developed more sensitive tools for examining what happens to water in the immediate vicinity of biological molecules. Inside a living cell, water exists in conditions that bulk water in a beaker does not experience. It is in close contact with vast numbers of charged surfaces, hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions, complex geometries that organize the molecules in specific ways, and continuous activity at every length scale from the molecular to the macroscopic. The question of whether the water in living systems has properties distinct from the water in laboratory glassware has become one of the most contested and consequential questions in modern biology. The answer matters because it bears on the fundamental question of what life actually is. If the water in living systems is just the same water as in a beaker, then biology is the elaborate chemistry of complex molecules dissolved in an unremarkable solvent. If the water in living systems has properties of its own, structured by the biological context in ways that contribute to the functioning of life, rather than merely providing a passive medium, then the picture of biology is significantly more interesting. Water itself, on this second possibility, becomes part of what biology actually is, rather than merely the stage on which biology occurs. The investigations that have addressed this question span several different scientific disciplines and produce results of varying degrees of certainty. Some of the work is well established and uncontroversial. Some of the work is contested but represents serious science conducted in legitimate research environments. Some of the work has been definitively rejected by the scientific community and represents a cautionary case of how the boundaries between rigorous inquiry and pseudoscience must be carefully maintained. We will be precise about which is which, because intellectual honesty about the science of water is essential to any credible inquiry into what water actually is. The well-established science begins with the dynamics of hydrogen bonds in liquid water. Computational and experimental studies over the past several decades have made it possible to track the formation and breaking of individual hydrogen bonds on timescales that were inaccessible to earlier generations of researchers. The picture that has emerged is of a liquid in continuous reorganization, with hydrogen bonds forming and breaking on timescales of about 1/trillionth of a second, the picosecond range, while individual water molecules diffuse and rotate at slightly slower rates. The cooperative dynamics of this constant reorganization are what give water its specific properties at the macroscopic scale. The hydrogen bond network is not static. It is a constantly shifting pattern of connections, with the network maintaining its overall statistical features while the specific bonds change continuously. This dynamic picture, developed across decades of work by researchers including Felix Franks, Eugene Stanley at Boston University, and many others, is now the standard understanding of how liquid water behaves at the molecular level. Within this dynamic picture, the behavior of water near biological surfaces has received particular attention. The interior of a living cell is densely packed with proteins, nucleic acids, lipid membranes, and other complex molecules. The concentration of biological molecules in cytoplasm is so high that significant fractions of the water in a cell are in close proximity to one or another macromolecular surface at any given moment. The properties of this surface-adjacent water have been studied extensively, and several distinct phenomena have been characterized. The first is what biochemists call hydration shells. When a biological molecule is dissolved in water, the water molecules immediately surrounding it are organized differently from bulk water. The water in the first hydration shell, the layer immediately adjacent to the molecular surface, is oriented by the electrical field of the surface, with its hydrogen bonds reorganized to accommodate the geometry of the macromolecule. The water in subsequent hydration shells is less strongly affected, and after several molecular diameters from the surface, the water becomes effectively indistinguishable from bulk water. The hydration shells of proteins are now understood to play essential roles in protein function. They contribute to the folding of proteins, to the recognition between proteins and their binding partners, and to the catalytic activity of enzymes. Without the specific organization of water in hydration shells, much of biological chemistry could not occur. The folding of proteins deserves particular attention because it illustrates how thoroughly water is integrated into the basic processes of life. A protein, when first produced by the ribosome, is a long chain of amino acids that must fold into a specific three-dimensional shape to function. The folding process is driven, to a substantial extent, by the interactions between the amino acid side chains and the surrounding water. Hydrophobic side chains, which do not form favorable interactions with water, are pushed toward the interior of the protein, where they can avoid contact with water. Hydrophilic side chains, which form favorable interactions with water, are arranged on the surface, where they can interact with the surrounding aqueous environment. The specific shape that a protein folds into is therefore not just a property of the protein itself. It is a property of the protein in its watery environment. Change the solvent, and the protein's preferred shape would change. The structures that proteins fold into, and the functions those structures support, depend at every step on the specific properties of the water around them. The second is the behavior of water in the confined geometries inside biological structures. Water in a narrow channel through a cell membrane, water inside the active site of an enzyme, water in the spaces between membranes, all behave differently from water in bulk solution. The confinement constrains the hydrogen bond network, producing molecular arrangements that bulk water cannot accommodate. The proton wires that conduct hydrogen ions through certain biological structures, including the enzymes that produce ATP in the mitochondria, depend on specific arrangements of water molecules that exist only in the confined geometries within the enzyme. These structured arrangements are not mystical. They are configurations of ordinary water molecules, organized by the surrounding biological context. But they are configurations that do not exist in bulk water, and that depend on the specific biological setting for their existence. A particularly striking example involves the aquaporins, the channels that allow water to flow rapidly across cell membranes. The aquaporins were discovered by Peter Agrey at Johns Hopkins University in the early 1990s, and Agrey received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2003 for the discovery. The remarkable feature of aquaporins is their selectivity. They allow water molecules to pass through cell membranes at very high rates, while excluding protons and ions, even though some of these are physically smaller than water molecules. The mechanism, which has been worked out through detailed structural studies, involves a specific arrangement of amino acids in the channel that interacts with each water molecule as it passes through, orienting the molecule in a particular way and excluding charged species through a combination of geometric and electrostatic effects. The behavior of water inside an aquaporin is, in a precise sense, not the behavior of bulk water. The aquaporin imposes a specific organization on the water molecules passing through it, and this imposed organization is what allows the channel to perform its biological function. Water in this confined geometry is not just water. Water in this confined geometry is part of a specific biological mechanism whose operation depends on the imposed structure. A more contested but seriously researched line of investigation has been pursued by Gerald Pollack at the University of Washington over the past 2 decades. Pollack and his collaborators have reported finding what they call exclusion zone water, a structured form of water that appears near hydrophilic surfaces and that exhibits properties distinct from ordinary bulk water. The exclusion zone, in Pollack's terminology, is a region adjacent to certain hydrophilic surfaces where ordinary solutes are excluded and where the water itself appears to have a different molecular organization. Pollack has reported that this water has different optical properties, different viscosity, and different electrical properties from bulk water. He has called it the 4th phase of water, distinct from solid, liquid, and gaseous forms. His 2013 book, The 4th Phase of Water, summarizes the experimental evidence he and his collaborators have gathered. The status of this work within mainstream physical chemistry is, as of this writing, contested. The basic experimental observations of solute exclusion near certain hydrophilic surfaces are well documented and have been replicated in independent laboratories. The interpretation of these observations as a fundamentally distinct phase of water, rather than as a particular kind of structured hydration shell, is not accepted by most mainstream researchers. Several alternative explanations have been proposed for the observed phenomena, including conventional electrokinetic effects and concentration gradients near charged surfaces. Pollack and his defenders have responded to these criticisms with arguments and additional experiments. The debate continues. What can be said responsibly is that something interesting is happening near hydrophilic surfaces, that the exact characterization of what is happening remains a matter of legitimate scientific dispute, and that the strongest claims about a distinct 4th phase of water with revolutionary implications are not currently established. Anyone interested in this work should engage with both Pollack's arguments and the criticisms of them, and should reserve judgment until the scientific community has reached more definite conclusions. What makes the Pollack work worth mentioning, despite its contested status, is that it represents a serious attempt to investigate water in conditions that more closely approximate the conditions inside living systems than do typical bulk water samples. Living cells are crowded with hydrophilic surfaces. The water inside a cell is rarely more than a few nanometers from some macromolecular surface. If the behavior of water near such surfaces differs measurably from the behavior of bulk water, then the picture of water in biology that is built up from studies of bulk water is necessarily incomplete. Whether Pollack's specific characterization of these differences is correct, or whether the differences are better described in conventional biochemical vocabulary, is a question for the ongoing research to settle. What the inquiry has established, even on the most cautious reading, is that the water in living systems is not the same as the water in a beaker, and that the differences matter for understanding how biology works. This is a careful position rather than a dramatic one. It acknowledges that interesting research is happening in this area, while declining to overstate what the research has established. The honest acknowledgement is that water in living systems has properties that depend on its biological context, that the behavior of water near biological surfaces differs measurably from the behavior of bulk water, and that some of the more dramatic claims about structured water remain contested within the scientific community. The picture of water in biology is more complex than the picture of water in a beaker. How much more complex, and exactly in what ways, is a matter of ongoing scientific investigation. A separate and more thoroughly rejected line of claims about water deserves explicit mention because it has produced widespread popular confusion. In 1988, the French immunologist Jacques Benveniste published a paper in the journal Nature claiming that water could retain a memory of substances that had been dissolved in it, even after the substances had been diluted to the point that no molecules of the original substance remained. The claim, if true, would have provided a scientific basis for the practice of homeopathy, which uses extreme dilutions of substances to produce supposed therapeutic effects. The journal Nature, recognizing the extraordinary nature of the claim, sent a team, including the magician James Randi and the editor John Maddox, to Benveniste's laboratory to investigate. Under controlled conditions, the team was unable to reproduce the reported effects. The investigation, published in Nature later in 1988, concluded that the original results had been the product of poor experimental controls. Benveniste's reputation was damaged, and the scientific consensus on water memory has remained, since then, that no such phenomenon has been demonstrated. A subsequent attempt to revive related claims came from Luc Montagnier, the Nobel laureate who shared the 2008 prize for the discovery of HIV. In 2009, Montagnier published papers reporting that DNA in water could produce electromagnetic signals that persisted after extreme dilution, suggesting some form of information retention by water. The claims were received with deep skepticism by the mainstream scientific community, and Montagnier's reputation in his later years was significantly damaged by his promotion of these and related ideas. As of the present, the scientific consensus is that water does not have memory in any sense that would support homeopathic practice, or that would extend the meaningful information retention of water beyond the femtosecond to picosecond timescales of hydrogen bond dynamics. The phrase water memory has, in popular usage, become associated with claims that the science has rejected, and any responsible discussion of water has to be clear that these specific claims are not supported by current evidence. This is important to state clearly because the genuine strangeness of water has been exploited in popular literature to support claims that the science does not endorse. The hydrogen bond dynamics of water are real. The structured hydration shells around biological molecules are real. The contested but serious work on exclusion zone water represents legitimate scientific inquiry. The popular claims about water memory, water consciousness, and water as a vehicle for non-physical information are not currently supported by any evidence that has survived rigorous scrutiny. The boundary between what the science supports and what it does not is precise, and it is essential to maintain that precision. Water is genuinely strange in scientifically established ways. Water is not strange in the ways that pseudoscientific frameworks have claimed. Within the boundary of established and seriously investigated science, the picture that has emerged is interesting in its own right. The water in living systems contributes to biology in ways that go beyond simply providing a solvent. Hydration shells around proteins are part of how proteins fold and function. Confined water in membrane channels and enzyme active sites participates in biological processes in specific ways that depend on its molecular arrangement. The dynamics of hydrogen bonds in liquid water, the cooperative reorganization of the network on picosecond timescales, contributes to the functional behavior of biological systems. None of this is mystical. All of it is being worked out in detailed scientific investigation, and what it suggests, when the various findings are considered together, is that water in biology is not a passive medium but an active participant in the chemistry of life. A particularly interesting line of investigation has emerged from the developing field of quantum biology, which examines whether quantum mechanical effects play roles in biological systems that classical physics cannot fully account for. The field has its origins in the recognition that certain biological processes operate at scales where quantum effects could, in principle, be relevant. Photosynthesis, in particular, has been shown to involve quantum coherent effects in the energy transfer through the photosynthetic apparatus. With the work of Graham Fleming at the University of California, Berkeley, and others establishing that quantum coherence persists in specific photosynthetic systems on timescales relevant to the energy transfer process. The implications for understanding photosynthesis are substantial, and similar investigations have been undertaken for other biological processes, including the navigation of migrating birds, the operation of olfactory receptors, and certain enzymatic reactions. The work on quantum coherence in photosynthesis deserves particular attention because it illustrates the kind of involvement that water might have in biological quantum effects. The photosynthetic apparatus in plants, algae, and certain bacteria captures sunlight using arrays of pigment molecules called chromophores. The energy from absorbed photons must be transferred through these arrays to the reaction center, where it is converted into chemical energy. The transfer process involves coherent quantum effects, with the energy traveling through the array in ways that classical hopping mechanisms cannot fully describe. The watery environment surrounding the chromophores plays a role in this process, both by maintaining the specific geometric arrangements that the coherent transfer requires and by interacting with the chromophores in ways that influence the transfer dynamics. The water is not just a passive medium. The water is part of how the quantum coherence is maintained and used. Among the questions that quantum biology has raised is whether quantum effects play roles in the behavior of water in biological systems. Proton transfer through enzyme active sites, for example, has been shown in some systems to involve quantum mechanical tunneling, in which protons move through energy barriers in ways that classical mechanics cannot account for. The work of Judith Klinman at the University of California, Berkeley, and others has documented the role of proton tunneling in specific enzymatic reactions, and the implications for understanding biological catalysis are still being worked out. The phenomenon involves protons effectively passing through energy barriers that classical particles could not overcome by exploiting their quantum mechanical wave-like properties. In water-mediated biological reactions, this kind of tunneling can be important for the efficiency of the underlying chemistry, allowing reactions to proceed that would be much slower or even impossible if classical mechanics were the only mechanism available. Whether and to what extent quantum effects are relevant for the broader behavior of water in biology, beyond these specific established cases, is an open question. The investigations are ongoing, and the answers are not yet settled. What can be said is that the question is not a trivial one. The water that participates in biology may, in some specific contexts, exhibit quantum mechanical features that the classical picture of water does not capture. The full implications of this, for how we understand biological water, and for how we understand the role of water in supporting the complex chemistry of life, remain to be worked out by the continuing research. This brings us to a broader question about why water, of all possible liquids, happens to be the medium of life. The Goldilocks fit between water and biology, which we considered in the previous inquiry, becomes more striking the more closely it is examined. Water's specific properties at every scale, from the molecular to the macroscopic, seem to be precisely what life requires. The hydrogen bond network produces the right thermal, solvent, and structural properties for biological chemistry. The dynamics of the network, on picosecond timescales, match the timescales relevant for biological processes. The behavior of water near surfaces produces the hydration shells that biological molecules depend on. The thermal capacity of water provides the buffering that organisms need. At every level, water is suited to biology in ways that other liquids are not. The question of why this is so has been the subject of considerable reflection. One answer, the answer that mainstream biology has generally accepted, is that life evolved to take advantage of whatever solvent happened to be available, and that the apparent fit reflects the adaptation of life's chemistry to water's properties rather than any deeper alignment. On this view, life on a planet with a different available solvent, if such life were possible, would have evolved chemistry adapted to that solvent. The fit between water and life is therefore not a fit between water specifically and life specifically. It is a fit between any solvent that life evolves in and the resulting chemistry of life on that planet. A different answer, the answer that some scientists and philosophers have explored, is that the fit between water and life is more specific than this. On this view, water has properties that make complex biological chemistry possible in ways that other liquids could not match, and life that arose in water has features that life in other liquids would not have. Whether or not life is possible in other liquids at all is, on this view, an open question that depends on the specific properties those liquids would have. The work of Christopher McKay at NASA Ames Research Center and others on the possibility of life in liquid methane on Saturn's moon Titan has been an attempt to address this question seriously. The conclusions are tentative. The chemistry of liquid methane is dramatically different from the chemistry of water, and whether anything resembling life as we know it could arise in such a medium remains uncertain. What is not uncertain is that water on Earth supports life in ways that are integrated at every level. The water you drink becomes the water in your blood, in your cells, in the hydration shells of every protein your body produces, in the active sites of every enzyme that catalyzes your metabolism. The water in a tree becomes the medium through which photosynthesis converts sunlight into chemical energy and through which the products of photosynthesis are distributed to every part of the tree's structure. The water in an ocean is the medium within which an enormous diversity of marine biology operates, with the chemistry of seawater providing the specific conditions that the life forms in it have evolved to depend on. At every scale of biological organization, water is not just present but constitutive. The biological systems are made of structures and processes that water makes possible and that other liquids could not, on the available evidence, support. This recognition has implications that go beyond the immediate questions of biology. If water is not just one substance among many but a substance with specific properties that make complex life possible, then the existence of life on Earth is, in part, the result of the planet having water available in liquid form across the temperature range where biology operates. The history of how Earth came to have liquid water on its surface, the geochemical and astronomical conditions that produced and preserved this water, the dynamics that have maintained the planetary water cycle across billions of years, are all part of the story of why life exists here at all. And the same story, when read more carefully, is a story about why water, the specific molecule that is roughly 2/3 of your body, is the substance that life is made of. This kind of recognition would have sounded familiar to several major contemplative traditions, who, by entirely different methods and from entirely different starting points, accorded water a position in their cosmologies that no other substance occupied. Long before any chemistry could measure hydrogen bonds or characterize hydration shells, traditions across the world treated water as something more than just one element among others. The Christian tradition, in its sacrament of baptism, made water the medium of spiritual rebirth. The earliest Christian writings on baptism, including the 3rd century treatise De Baptismo by Tertullian, articulated a theology in which the immersion in water represented a death and resurrection, the dissolving of the old self in the waters of baptism, and the emergence of a new life from those waters. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Rome in the middle of the 1st century, articulated this theology in his 6th chapter, where he described baptism as a being buried with Christ in death, so that, just as Christ was raised from the dead, the believer might walk in newness of life. The water, in this theological framework, was not merely a symbol of cleansing. The water was the medium of an actual passage from one state of being to another, the substance through which the spiritual transformation occurred. The Hindu tradition placed water at the center of its cosmology in similarly fundamental ways. The Ganga, the river that flows through northern India and that has been the most sacred geographical feature of Hindu tradition for thousands of years, is not merely a river in the geographical sense. The Ganga is a divine being, a goddess in feminine form, whose waters carry spiritual purification for those who bathe in them. The mythology of how the Ganga came to flow on earth, descending from heaven through the matted hair of the god Shiva, articulates a cosmology in which water itself is divine activity, the flowing of cosmic life into the world. Devotees who travel to the banks of the Ganga to bathe and to receive the waters in their cupped hands are participating in a tradition that has placed water at the center of religious practice for as long as the tradition has existed. The water is not in this tradition merely H2O. The water is the visible manifestation of divine activity in the world. These traditions, which we will examine in detail in our next inquiry, did not arrive at their insights through chemical analysis. They arrived through sustained attention to the role of water in human experience and in the rituals and practices that they developed for engaging with what they took to be most sacred. What they recognized, in their own different vocabularies, was that water occupied a position in the order of being that no other substance occupied. Water was the medium of life. Water was the medium of cleansing and renewal. Water was, in some sense, each tradition articulated differently, more than just a chemical compound. Water was a participant in something more fundamental than ordinary chemistry could capture. The convergence between these traditional recognitions and the modern scientific picture of water as the unique medium of biological complexity is, when both bodies of inquiry are taken seriously, striking. The traditions recognized water as central to life because water was in fact central to life. The traditions accorded water sacred significance because water did, in fact, have specific features that made it possible for biology and consciousness to exist in the way they do. The vocabulary of the traditions is theological, and the vocabulary of the science is biochemical. But what is being recognized in both cases is the same set of facts about a substance whose specific properties are intricately suited to the elaboration of life and the unfolding of conscious existence. We will be working out the implications of this convergence across the inquiries to come. But first, what can be said in summary about the science we have examined in this inquiry? Water in living systems has properties that depend on its biological context. The hydrogen bond network reorganizes itself in response to the surfaces of biological molecules, producing hydration shells that contribute to protein folding and enzyme function. The behavior of water in confined biological geometries differs from the behavior of bulk water in ways that are essential to specific biological processes. Some of the more dramatic claims about structured water remain contested within the scientific community, and the popular claims about water memory and water consciousness are not supported by current evidence. The genuine strangeness of water, however, is well established, and it includes specific features that contribute to the functioning of biology in ways that are still being worked out. The fit between water and life is real, intricate, and pervasive. The question of how to interpret this fit, whether as evolutionary adaptation, as deeper alignment, or as something that requires categories beyond what current science provides, remains open. What is not in question is that water is not just any liquid. Water is a substance whose specific features are the foundation of every biological process you depend on, and that has been recognized in different vocabularies by the contemplative traditions across the entire span of recorded history. In the next inquiry, we will examine in detail what those traditions actually said about water, how they integrated water into their religious and philosophical frameworks, and what their integrations mean in light of the picture that modern science has now arrived at through its own different methods. The traditions and the science are pointing, despite their different vocabularies, at the same set of facts about a substance whose specific features make life possible. And the convergence between them is, when honestly examined, one of the more remarkable convergences in the broader convergence between contemplative tradition and modern science that this entire investigation has been tracing. Long before any laboratory could measure the dynamics of hydrogen bonds, before any biochemistry could characterize the role of water in protein folding, before any quantum biology could investigate the coherent effects in biological water, contemplative traditions in widely separated cultures recognized something special about water and accorded it a place in their cosmologies and religious practices that no other substance occupied. The methods used were not measurement and theory. The methods used were sustained attention to the role of water in human experience, in the cycle of life and death and renewal that water enabled, and in the rituals that those traditions developed for engaging with what they took to be most sacred. What these traditions found, in their own different vocabularies, was that water was not just one element among others. Water was the medium of life. Water was the agent of cleansing and renewal. Water was, in some sense, each tradition articulated differently, a participant in the deepest mysteries of existence. And the convergence between these traditional recognitions and the modern scientific understanding of water as the unique medium of biological complexity is, when both bodies of inquiry are taken seriously, one of the more striking convergences in the history of human thought. The most theologically developed articulation of water's significance in the Western religious traditions appears in the Christian sacrament of baptism. Baptism is not, in Christian theology, merely a symbolic ceremony. It is a sacrament, a ritual act in which the physical action of immersion in, or pouring of water, is held to actually accomplish a spiritual transformation. The theological framework that supports this claim has been developed across 2,000 years of Christian reflection, from the earliest writings of the New Testament to the most sophisticated contemporary sacramental theology. And what the framework articulates, when taken seriously in its own terms, is a vision of water as not just a symbol of spiritual cleansing, but as the actual medium of spiritual rebirth. The earliest extensive Christian treatise on baptism is De Baptismo, written by Tertullian in Carthage in the late 2nd or early 3rd century. Tertullian's treatise, the first sustained theological reflection on the sacrament in Christian history, articulates a theology of water that draws together biblical, philosophical, and ritual elements into a comprehensive vision. Water, Tertullian argues, was the substance over which the Spirit of God hovered at the beginning of creation. Water was the medium through which Noah was saved from the flood. Water was the substance that flowed from the rock when Moses struck it in the wilderness. Water was the river in which Jesus himself was baptized by John. The persistent presence of water across the salvation history of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament was, for Tertullian, evidence that water occupied a particular role in the divine economy. Water was, in his theological vocabulary, sanctified by the divine presence that had repeatedly chosen it as the medium of divine action. And in baptism, the water of the Christian sacrament was understood as the contemporary expression of this same sanctified medium, the substance through which the believer entered into the death and resurrection of Christ. The death and resurrection symbolism of baptism, articulated by the Apostle Paul in his 6th chapter of the letter to the Romans, written in the middle of the 1st century, makes the theological claim particularly vivid. Paul writes that baptism is a being buried with Christ in death, so that, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, the baptized believer might walk in newness of life. The immersion in the water represents, in Paul's framework, an actual death, a passage through the waters of dissolution that mirrors Christ's passage through death. The emergence from the water represents, equally, a resurrection, a rising into a new life that is the believer's participation in the resurrection of Christ. The water, in this framework, is not merely a symbol that points to the death and resurrection. The water is the medium through which the death and resurrection are sacramentally enacted in the life of the believer. The believer who emerges from the baptismal water is, in the technical theological vocabulary, a new creation, having passed through the dissolution of the old self and into the resurrection of the new. This theology was developed and refined across the patristic period by the major Christian theologians. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, articulated the broader theology of sacraments within which baptism took its specific place. Augustine's framework, expressed in compact form in his treatise on the Gospel of John, distinguished between the visible sign and the invisible reality that the sacrament accomplishes. The water, in baptism, is the visible sign. The grace that the water conveys is the invisible reality. The two are not separable. The visible sign accomplishes the invisible reality through divine institution. The water is therefore not just water in the ordinary sense. The water in baptism, by virtue of its sacramental use, becomes the actual medium through which divine grace enters the soul of the baptized. The chemistry of the water remains the same chemistry that all water has. The theological function of the water, in the sacramental context, is to be the bearer of grace. John Chrysostom, the great Greek-speaking theologian of the late 4th century who served as Archbishop of Constantinople, articulated the same theology in language that emphasizes the transformative power of the baptismal water. The water of baptism, Chrysostom preached, is a tomb and a womb. It is a tomb in which the old self is buried. It is a womb in which the new self is born. The simultaneity of death and birth in a single immersion captures, in compact form, the entire theological structure of the sacrament. The believer dies in the water. The believer is born in the water. The two events are not sequential but simultaneous, and the water is the medium through which this paradoxical simultaneity is made possible. The water itself, on Chrysostom's preaching, becomes a participant in the work of salvation, the substance through which the believer enters into the central mystery of the Christian faith. The double symbolism of tomb and womb that Chrysostom articulated has structural parallels to the biological reality of water that modern science has now confirmed. In biological terms, water is the medium of both decomposition and gestation, both the process by which complex structures dissolve back into their constituent elements and the process by which new complex structures emerge from simpler beginnings. The waters of decomposition and the waters of gestation are, in molecular fact, the same kind of substance, organized differently in different biological contexts. The dead body decomposes in water. The new life develops in the amniotic fluid that surrounds the embryo. The cycle of dissolution and emergence that the Christian theology of baptism articulates is, in biological terms, the actual cycle that water mediates throughout the natural world. The theology is not contradicting the biology. The theology is articulating, in its own vocabulary, structural features of how water operates that the biology has now confirmed in its own different vocabulary. The Eastern Orthodox tradition has preserved and developed this theology of water in particularly elaborated form. The Festival of Theophany, celebrated on January 6th, commemorates the baptism of Jesus and includes the great blessing of waters, a ritual in which the water of natural springs, rivers, and the sea is blessed by the Church. The theological claim of this ritual is that the blessing extends in some sense to all water, that the water of the world is sanctified by the prayers and the action of the Holy Spirit. The faithful then take blessed water home to use throughout the year, sprinkling it on their houses, drinking it for blessing, applying it for healing. The practice rests on the conviction that water, properly engaged with through the prayers and rituals of the Church, becomes a medium of grace beyond what its ordinary chemistry could provide. The water remains chemically water. The theological function of the water in the Orthodox sacramental life extends beyond chemistry into the broader work of divine action in the world. The prayers used in the Great Blessing of Waters articulate, in liturgical form, the theological vision that has been developed across the Christian tradition. The water in these prayers is invoked in connection with the moments of cosmic significance in which water has been involved. The water that the Spirit moved over at creation, the water that flooded the earth in the days of Noah, the water of the Red Sea that opened for the Israelites, the water that Moses brought from the rock, the water of the Jordan in which Jesus was baptized, the water that flowed from the side of Christ on the cross. The accumulation of these scriptural references in the prayers of the blessing is not arbitrary. The accumulation is meant to articulate the theological vision that water has, throughout the entire arc of salvation history, been the medium of divine action. The water that is being blessed in the contemporary ritual is, in this vision, in continuity with all the water that has been involved in divine action across the entire span of biblical and Christian history. The Christian theology of water, taken across the entire span of its development from Tertullian through Augustine, through Chrysostom, through the medieval scholastic tradition, through the Reformation debates, through the modern liturgical theologies, articulates a vision of water as a substance whose ordinary chemical properties are integrated with extraordinary theological functions. The water is, in its ordinary aspect, the same H2O that fills all rivers and oceans and biological systems. The water is, in its sacramental aspect, the medium through which divine grace enters human life. The two aspects are not in competition. They are integrated in the theological framework into a single vision of how the physical and the spiritual relate in the actual practice of Christian life. And what this framework recognizes in its own theological vocabulary is what modern science has now articulated in different vocabulary, that water is a substance whose specific properties are intricately suited to the most fundamental processes of life. The Hindu tradition arrived at structurally similar recognitions through its own different framework, with water occupying a position in Hindu cosmology and religious practice that has no precise equivalent in any other tradition. The most striking expression of this position is the river Ganga, the river that flows from the Himalayas across northern India to the Bay of Bengal, and that has been the most sacred geographical feature of Hindu religious life for as long as the tradition has existed. The Ganga is not merely a river in the geographical sense. The Ganga is, in Hindu religious vocabulary, a goddess in feminine form called Ganga Mata, the Mother Ganga, whose waters carry spiritual purification for those who bathe in them or who receive the waters in their cupped hands. The mythology of how the Ganga came to flow on earth articulates the theological status of the river. The Ganga, in the standard Puranic accounts, originally flowed in heaven, where she was the celestial river of the gods. The sage Bhagirath, in a long story told across the Ramayana and various Puranas, performed extreme austerities to bring the Ganga down to earth, so that her waters could provide spiritual purification for the souls of his ancestors. The descent of the Ganga from heaven was, however, dangerous, because the force of her descending waters would have shattered the earth itself. The god Shiva, in response to Bhagiratha's prayers, agreed to receive the descending waters in his matted hair, dispersing the force across his locks before allowing the river to flow gently to the surface of the world. The myth, in its symbolic structure, articulates a theological vision of water as a divine substance whose presence on earth is the result of cosmic activity, not merely a feature of natural geology. The water of the Ganga is, in this framework, not just water. The water is the descended form of a divine being whose presence in the world is the gift of the gods to humanity. The practice that flows from this theology has shaped Hindu religious life for thousands of years. Pilgrimage to the banks of the Ganga, particularly to the cities of Varanasi, Haridwar, Allahabad, and Rishikesh, has been one of the central religious practices of Hindu tradition. The Kumbh Mela, the largest religious gathering in the world, occurs at the confluence of the Ganga with other sacred rivers and draws tens of millions of pilgrims who come specifically to bathe in the waters during the auspicious astrological alignments. The ash of cremated bodies is traditionally scattered into the Ganga in the conviction that the river will carry the soul of the departed toward liberation. The water itself is bottled and carried home for use in domestic religious rituals, with the conviction that even small quantities of Ganga water carry spiritual potency far beyond what their chemical composition would suggest. What is striking about the Hindu treatment of water, when it is examined alongside the broader Hindu tradition, is that the sanctification of water is not limited to the Ganga. The Vedic literature, the foundational scriptures of the Hindu tradition composed in northwestern India between approximately 1500 and 500 years before the Common Era, contains numerous hymns to water as a divine principle. The 9th hymn of the 10th book of the Rig Veda, called the Hymn to the Waters, addresses the waters in language that treats them as living divine beings. The opening line of the hymn, in its compressed Sanskrit, declares that the waters truly are healers, that the waters provide nourishment to the body, that the waters sustain the life of the world. The waters, in the Vedic vocabulary, are not just chemical compounds. They are divine entities whose presence in the world is, itself, a gift of the cosmic order. The Vedic ritual practice of tarpana, the offering of water to the ancestors, articulates the same theological vision in practical form. In tarpana, the practitioner pours water from cupped hands while reciting specific mantras, with the conviction that the offering nourishes the souls of the ancestors in the realms beyond death. The water, in this ritual, is not just a physical substance. The water is the medium through which the offering passes from the world of the living to the world of the dead. The chemistry of the water is the chemistry of any water. The ritual function of the water in the practice of tarpana extends beyond chemistry into the broader work of maintaining the relationship between living beings and their ancestors. The Taoist tradition of ancient China contributed an articulation of water's significance that, in its own way, may be the most philosophically penetrating of any contemplative tradition's reflections on this substance. The Tao Te Ching, composed in China in the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era and traditionally attributed to the sage Lao Tzu, contains, in its 8th chapter, one of the most celebrated philosophical statements about water in any literature. The chapter opens with the phrase Shang Shan Ruo Shu, which is usually translated as the highest goodness is like water, or the supreme virtue resembles water. The phrase has been the subject of commentary across more than 2 millennia of Chinese philosophical reflection, and its compressed brilliance has made it one of the most often cited passages of the entire Taoist canon. What Lao Tzu articulates in this passage is a vision of water as the perfect manifestation of the Tao itself. Water benefits all things, the chapter continues, without striving against them. Water flows to the lowest places that other things avoid. Water adapts to every container without losing its own nature. Water is soft and yielding, but it can wear away the hardest stone over time. Water gives life, sustains life, and accepts the role that the world's gravitational organization places it in, without resistance and without complaint. The qualities of water, in Lao Tzu's analysis, are precisely the qualities that the wise person should cultivate. To live in accord with the Tao is to live in accord with the way water lives. To act effectively in the world is to act as water acts, with adaptive flexibility, with persistent purpose, with willingness to accept the lowest position when the lowest position is what the situation requires. The 78th chapter of the Tao Te Ching returns to the same theme with even greater philosophical force. There is nothing in the world more soft and yielding than water, the chapter declares, and yet for attacking the firm and the strong, nothing is its equal. The paradox is not just rhetorical. The paradox is the central philosophical insight of the Taoist analysis of water. The softness and yielding nature of water are not weaknesses, they are the source of water's strength. The water that adapts to every container, that flows around every obstacle, that descends to every low place, is the same water that, given enough time, carves canyons through solid rock. The strength comes from the softness, the persistence comes from the yielding, and the lesson, in Taoist practical philosophy, is that effective action in the world looks more like water than like any of the more obvious models of force and aggression that ordinary intuition might suggest. This Taoist analysis of water has structural parallels to what modern science has come to recognize about water's specific role in biology. Water's effectiveness as the medium of life is not the result of any aggressive or forceful properties. It is the result of water's specific combination of fluidity, adaptability, hydrogen bond network, and capacity to accommodate complex chemistry without imposing its own structure too rigidly. Water, in biological context, exhibits exactly the qualities that Lao Tzu identified as the perfection of the Tao. Water adapts to every biological container without losing its essential character. Water carries life-giving substances without competing with them for the central role. Water yields to the structures it inhabits while persisting through the changes that those structures undergo. The structural parallel between Lao Tzu's philosophical analysis of water and the modern biochemical understanding of water's biological function is, when honestly examined, striking. The vocabularies differ. The methods are completely different, but what is being recognized, in both cases, is the same set of features about how water works in the world. The Islamic tradition contributed its own articulation of water's significance through several distinct channels. The Quran itself, as we noted in our first inquiry, contains in chapter 21 and verse 30 the explicit statement that God has made every living thing from water. The verse, when read alongside the modern biological understanding that life is constitutively aqueous, has a directness that ordinary scientific intuition does not always associate with religious literature. The Quranic claim is not metaphorical. The claim is, by the standards of modern biology, literally true. A complementary articulation appears in the chapter 25 and verse 54, which describes God as the one who created humans from water. The verse has been the subject of considerable Islamic theological reflection, with the broader tradition recognizing that the human body is, in physical fact, predominantly water, and that the Quranic articulation captures this fact in compressed form. The water that constitutes the human body is not, on the traditional Islamic reading, simply a chemical fact. The water is the divine gift that makes human existence possible at all. Beyond these Quranic articulations, the Islamic tradition has placed water at the center of religious practice through the ritual of wudu, the ablution that precedes the 5 daily prayers. Wudu involves the washing of specific parts of the body with water in a specific sequence, with the prayer that follows being valid only if the wudu has been properly performed. The theological function of wudu is purification, both physical and spiritual, with the water serving as the medium through which the practitioner enters into a state of ritual cleanness suitable for prayer. The practice has structured the daily lives of devout Muslims for 14 centuries, with the water of wudu being one of the most consistent points of contact between the believer and the broader theological framework of Islamic life. A particularly sacred role within Islamic tradition is occupied by the water of Zamzam, the well in Mecca whose waters have been associated with the story of Hagar and her son Ishmael. According to the Islamic tradition, Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, was abandoned in the desert near what would become Mecca. As her infant son lay dying of thirst, she ran between the hills of Safa and Marwa seeking water, and the angel Gabriel struck the ground and water sprang forth. This water became the well of Zamzam, and pilgrims who visit Mecca for the Hajj or Umrah drink from this well as part of the pilgrimage. The water of Zamzam is bottled and carried to Muslim communities around the world, where it is treated with particular respect and used for specific religious purposes. The chemistry of Zamzam water has been studied scientifically and found to be similar to the chemistry of other water sources in that geographical region, with some specific mineral characteristics. The theological function of Zamzam water in the Islamic tradition extends beyond what its chemistry could account for. The water is, in the traditional understanding, a continuing testimony to the divine provision that saved Hagar and Ishmael in their distress. The Sufi tradition, the contemplative wing of Islam, has articulated additional reflections on water that draw together the ritual, theological, and mystical aspects of the broader tradition. The Sufi poets, including most famously Rumi in the 13th century, have used water imagery extensively in their verse, treating water as a metaphor for the soul's relationship to the divine source, from which it emerges and to which it returns. The drop that returns to the ocean that gives rise to countless drops, the river that flows toward the sea, the spring that pours forth from hidden depths, all serve in Sufi poetry as figures for the soul's journey through the various stages of the contemplative life. The choice of water as the central metaphor for these reflections is not arbitrary. Water is, in the Sufi vision, as in the broader Islamic tradition, the substance whose features most directly suggest the structure of the spiritual life as the tradition understands it. The Jewish tradition has placed water at the center of religious practice through the institution of the mikveh, the ritual immersion pool. The mikveh is a body of water collected according to specific halakhic requirements, used for ritual purification at various transitions in the religious life. Conversion to Judaism involves immersion in a mikveh. Marriage, particularly for traditional brides, includes immersion in a mikveh as part of the preparation. The recovery from various states of ritual impurity, particularly those associated with the menstrual cycle and with contact with death, involves immersion in a mikveh. The institution of the mikveh has structured Jewish religious life for thousands of years, providing a continuous practice of immersion in water as a marker of transition between states of being. The theological framework of the mikveh treats water as the medium of renewal and rebirth. The Hebrew phrase Mayim Hayim, living waters, captures the idea that the water of the mikveh is not merely chemical water, but living water. Water that has been gathered and held in conditions that maintain its connection to the natural cycle of rain and groundwater that the tradition treats as the divine provision. The immersion in the mikveh is not merely a washing in the ordinary sense. It is a return to the primordial waters of creation, a brief experience of the watery substrate from which the world itself emerged in the Genesis narrative. The person who emerges from the mikveh emerges, in the theological framework, as a new creation, having passed through the waters of dissolution and into a renewed state of being. The Buddhist tradition contributed its own treatment of water within its broader framework of the four primary elements that constitute physical phenomena. The element of water, called apodhatu in the Pali language and apa in Sanskrit, is one of the 4 elements identified by classical Buddhist analysis as the basic constituents of material existence. The other 3 are earth, fire, and air. Water, in this framework, represents the principle of cohesion, the binding together that holds physical phenomena into the forms they take. The biological body is understood, in this analytical framework, as a particular combination of these 4 elements, with water playing a specific role in its constitution. The framework is not theological in the sense of treating water as divine. The framework is analytical, treating water as a basic constituent of physical reality whose specific features contribute to the structure of the world. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has incorporated water into specific practices of contemplation and ritual. The bumpa, the ceremonial water vase used in various Tibetan rituals, is filled with water that has been blessed through specific contemplative procedures. The water is then used in initiation ceremonies, in healing rituals, and in other practices that involve transmitting the spiritual energy that the contemplative work has generated. The framework of these practices treats water as a medium that can carry and transmit specific forms of spiritual influence, with the blessed water being a vehicle for the work of contemplation, extending beyond the immediate practitioner to those who receive the blessed substance. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their profound differences in cultural context, theological commitment, and practical orientation, is a structural recognition that has clear parallels to what modern science has now articulated in its own technical vocabulary. Water is not just one substance among others. Water has specific features that have made water central to life, central to ritual, and central to the religious imagination across all the major contemplative traditions of the world. The contemplative traditions did not arrive at these recognitions through molecular spectroscopy or quantum biology. They arrived through sustained attention to the role of water in human experience and to the rituals and practices that those traditions developed for engaging with what they took to be most sacred. And what they recognized, in their own different vocabularies, is structurally parallel to what modern science has now confirmed about water's specific role as the unique medium of biological complexity. The convergence is not equivalence. The Christian sacrament of baptism is not the Hindu pilgrimage to the Ganga, is not the Taoist analysis of water, as the perfection of the Tao is not, the Islamic ritual of wudu is not the Jewish institution of the mikveh. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own context. The vocabularies differ, the practical implications differ, the theological frameworks differ profoundly. What they share, despite these differences, is the recognition that water occupies a position in the order of being that no other substance occupies, and that the appropriate response to water includes practices and reflections that engage with this special position. And modern science, working from entirely different premises and using entirely different methods, has arrived at a structurally similar recognition through its own roots. Water is not just any liquid. Water is a substance whose specific features make life possible, and that fact is one of the deepest facts about the world we inhabit. What this means for the question that has been driving this entire investigation, the question of why water occupies the position it does in our existence, is the question that the final inquiry will pursue. The science is now in place. The body of contemplative reflection has been laid out alongside the body of scientific reflection. What remains is to ask what all of this means, finally, for the particular configurations of water that we are, the bodies whose constitution is more than half water, and whose every cellular process depends on the specific properties of this substance. The strangeness of water is, in some sense the inquiries are still working to articulate, the strangeness of our own existence as beings made of water In a world that has water at its core, you are made of water. More than half of your body, by mass, is the same molecule whose anomalies and biological roles we have been examining across these inquiries. The water in your blood, the water in your cells, the water in the hydration shells around every protein your body produces, the water in the active sites of every enzyme that catalyzes your metabolism, are all configurations of the same substance whose specific features make complex biology possible at all. This is the situation we now have to face, not as an abstraction, but as the most personal fact about being alive. The strangeness of water that the science has documented is not happening in some distant chemistry laboratory. It is happening in you, continuously, at every level of your biological existence. Every breath you take involves water transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide through your bloodstream. Every thought you have involves water-mediated chemistry in your neurons. Every meal you eat is broken down and distributed by water-mediated processes. Every moment of your conscious life is supported by the specific properties of this single molecule. And the convergence between this scientific recognition and the contemplative recognitions across multiple traditions about water as the medium of life and spiritual transformation is one of the more striking convergences this entire investigation has uncovered. Before drawing out what this means, intellectual honesty requires examining the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating, and the field of water science has suffered enough from such cheating to warrant extra caution. The first and most important objection concerns the persistent confusion in popular literature between scientifically established facts about water and pseudoscientific claims that the science has rejected. The claims about water memory associated with Jacques Benveniste's 1988 paper, the claims about electromagnetic information retention associated with Luc Montagnier's work in his later years, and the claims about water responding to human emotions and intentions associated with Masaru Emoto's photographs of water crystals from his 1999 book, Messages from Water, are all examples of claims that have been carefully evaluated by mainstream science and found wanting. Emoto's claims in particular deserve specific mention because they have spread widely in popular culture. Emoto reported that water exposed to positive words and emotions formed beautiful crystalline structures when frozen, while water exposed to negative words formed ugly or distorted structures. The methodological problems with these reports are substantial. The selection of which crystals to photograph was not blinded. The conditions under which the water was frozen were not controlled in ways that would allow rigorous comparison. The interpretation of crystal aesthetics was subjective. When other researchers attempted to replicate Emoto's findings under more controlled conditions, they did not find the effects he reported. The scientific consensus is that Emoto's claims are not supported by evidence, and that the popular books and films based on his work, however emotionally moving they may be to readers, do not reflect any actual properties of water that scientific investigation has been able to confirm. This is important to state clearly, because the popular conflation of these rejected claims with the genuine and rigorous science of water has done damage on both sides. The genuine strangeness of water, the documented anomalies, the legitimate research on hydration shells and confined water and quantum biology has been discredited by association with the pseudoscientific claims. And the contemplative traditions, which have their own deep and worthwhile reflections on water, have been distorted by the suggestion that they were anticipating or supporting the pseudoscientific framework. The traditions did not promise that water responds to human emotions in the way Emoto claimed. The traditions did not promise that information could be transmitted through water in the way the homeopathic frameworks claim. The traditions promised something different and, in their own terms, more important. They articulated a vision of water as the medium of life and the symbol of spiritual transformation, drawing on what they recognized about water's actual role in human existence. The vision is real. The vision is profound. The vision is also distinct from the pseudoscientific claims that have been made in popular literature, and the distinction matters. The second objection concerns the contested status of work like Gerald Pollack's research on what he calls the fourth phase of water. As we noted in our earlier inquiry, Pollack's basic experimental observations about solute exclusion near hydrophilic surfaces have been replicated, but his interpretation of these observations as a fundamentally distinct phase of water is not accepted by most mainstream researchers. The honest acknowledgement is that this work represents legitimate scientific inquiry, but the strongest claims about its significance for biology and medicine remain unconfirmed. Anyone interested in the field has to engage with both Pollack's arguments and the criticisms of them, and has to reserve judgment until further investigation produces more conclusive results. The framework we have been building does not depend on Pollack's specific claims being correct. It depends only on the well-established recognition that water in biological contexts has properties that depend on its biological setting, and that these properties are essential to how life works. A third objection concerns the Goldilocks fit between water and life that has been a recurring theme in our analysis. Some philosophers and scientists have argued that the apparent fit is, on closer examination, less remarkable than it appears. Life, on this view, evolved on a planet with the materials available, and the chemistry of life therefore reflects the chemistry of the available materials, rather than any deeper alignment between water and life specifically. If life had evolved on a planet with different available solvents, the chemistry of that life would have adapted to those solvents, and we would now be making the same Goldilocks argument about whichever liquid happened to be the medium of life on that other planet. The fit between water and life on this objection is not a fit between water specifically and life specifically. It is a fit between any solvent that life evolves in and the resulting chemistry of life on that planet. This objection deserves serious consideration. It is true that we have only one example of life, and that we cannot definitively establish what kinds of biology might be possible in other solvents. The work on potential life in liquid methane on Saturn's moon Titan, which we mentioned earlier, represents a serious scientific attempt to address this question. The conclusions remain tentative. What can be said responsibly is that, on the available evidence, water has specific properties that make complex biological chemistry possible in ways that no other liquid we know of can match. Whether life is possible in other liquids at all, and what such life would look like if it existed, is genuinely unsettled. But the specific suitability of water to the kind of complex biology that exists on Earth is empirically well established, regardless of how we ultimately interpret what this suitability means in the broader cosmic context. A fourth objection concerns the convergence claim itself. The contemplative traditions developed their reflections on water in religious and ritual contexts, and the resemblance between their reflections and modern scientific understanding might be coincidental rather than indicative of any deeper alignment. The traditions placed water at the center of religious practice because water was central to human life. The objection goes, and any human tradition that paid attention to its environment would have noticed water's importance. The convergence between this attention and modern biochemical understanding is therefore unsurprising. Both bodies of inquiry are noticing the same prominent feature of human existence. The fact that they describe this feature in different vocabularies does not establish that they are converging on any deeper insight about reality. This objection requires care. It is true that the prominence of water in human life is what made water a focus of attention for both contemplative and scientific inquiry. But the structural recognitions we have been examining go beyond the simple observation that water is important. The contemplative traditions recognized water as the medium of life in ways that anticipate the modern biological understanding of water as constitutively involved in every cellular process. The traditions recognized water as the agent of cleansing and renewal in ways that anticipate the modern understanding of water as the medium of decomposition and gestation, dissolution and reformation. The Taoist analysis of water as exemplifying the perfection of effective action through adaptability and persistence anticipates the modern recognition of how water functions as a biological medium through exactly these qualities. The convergence is not just attention to a common subject. The convergence is on specific structural features of how water actually works in the world, and this convergence is more than what mere coincidence of attention would produce. A fifth and important objection comes from the opposite direction. It concerns the danger of making too much of the convergence between science and contemplative tradition, of using the structural parallels as a way of giving the contemplative claims more authority than they deserve, or of using the contemplative reflections as a way of giving the scientific claims more meaning than they support. The traditions and the science are doing different things. The traditions are doing religious and contemplative work, with their own commitments and their own purposes. The science is doing empirical investigation, with its own methods and its own constraints. To collapse these into a single inquiry, in which the science validates the traditions, or the traditions enrich the science, may distort both. The science may end up being read for spiritual significance it does not actually have. The traditions may end up being read for empirical content they do not actually claim. Either distortion compromises the integrity of what was being done in each case. This objection is particularly worth taking seriously, because the appeal of finding deep connections between science and tradition can lead to exactly the kind of distortion the objection describes. The honest position is to maintain the distinction between what the science actually establishes and what the traditions actually claim, while also acknowledging the structural parallels that careful examination reveals. The parallels are real, but they are parallels, not identities. The science is not the traditions. The traditions are not the science. The convergence is at the level of structural recognition about how water actually functions in the world, and the convergence is significant precisely because the two bodies of inquiry arrived at it by completely different methods. To respect this convergence is to acknowledge it without collapsing the distinctions that make it meaningful. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty, but a structural picture that holds up under examination. Water is a substance whose specific properties are intricately suited to the elaboration of life. The chemistry of water is well understood in many respects, and there are aspects of biological water that remain matters of active research. The contemplative traditions, working from entirely different methods, articulated structurally similar pictures of water as the medium of life and spiritual significance. The convergence is real, even as the specific frameworks of science and tradition remain distinct, and the implications for how a person understands the most basic substance of which they are made follow from the recognition rather than from any specific metaphysical commitment. The picture has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The recognition that quantum mechanical effects play roles in biological processes, including in water-mediated reactions and in the operation of biological machinery that depends on water, fits naturally into the broader picture of how reality is structured at multiple levels. The water that you drink and the water that constitutes your body is not just classical chemistry. The water is, in specific contexts, the medium through which quantum coherent effects, proton tunneling, and other quantum phenomena play roles in biological function. The classical and quantum aspects of water are integrated into a single substance whose biological role depends on the integration. The recognition that biological systems may function as antennas for engaging with the broader information environment of their cosmic context takes on additional meaning when the antennas are understood as water-saturated structures. Whatever the specific mechanisms by which biological systems engage with their environments, those engagements happen through chemistry that is mediated by water. The water in your nervous system is part of how your body relates to the world. The water in your sensory organs is part of how you perceive your environment. The water in every cellular structure that supports your life is part of how you exist as a living biological being in continuous exchange with the cosmos that contains you. The recognition that the universe has features that resemble organized information processing on cosmic scales finds its biological correlate in the recognition that life on Earth is an enormous information processing system mediated by water. Every cell is a water-based information processor. Every organism is a coordinated system of water-based information processors. Every ecosystem is a vast network of water-mediated information exchange. The cosmic patterns of information processing that some research has identified at the largest scales have, in biological systems, water-based correlates that show how the same general principles operate at the molecular and cellular scales as well. The recognition that everything that exists is at some level a periodic excitation of underlying fields takes on additional resonance when applied to the specific case of water. The hydrogen bonds that constitute water's network structure are constantly forming and breaking on picosecond timescales. The molecular vibrations of water occur at specific frequencies that contribute to the substance's spectroscopic signature. The water in your body is, at every level, a system of vibrations and oscillations whose specific patterns are part of how the substance operates as the medium of life. The vibrational picture of physical reality, taken seriously, has water as one of its most concrete expressions. The recognition that what looks empty is actually full, that the apparent emptiness of the regions between matter is a substrate of intense activity, applies in modified form to water as well. The water that fills the regions between the cellular structures of your body, the water that mediates the interactions between biological molecules, the water that occupies the spaces that classical biology might have treated as merely the background within which biology occurs, is itself a substrate of activity. The biochemistry that supports your existence is not just the chemistry of the visible biological structures. The biochemistry is, equally, the chemistry of the water that fills the spaces between those structures. And that water is not empty space, but active medium. The recognition that information has weight, that the universe is informational at its deepest level, has a biological correlate in the recognition that water is the medium of biological information processing. The DNA in your cells is read in water. The proteins that read the DNA are water-saturated and dependent on water for their function. The signals that travel through your nervous system propagate through water-based ionic gradients. The information that constitutes your existence, at every biological level, is processed in water. The deep informational structure that physics has been articulating as the foundation of reality finds, in biology, a particular elaboration through water-mediated processes. The recognition that the integrated self dissolves and reconstitutes across the gap of deep sleep, that the patterns of selfhood are preserved in some substrate while the experiencing subject is absent, takes on additional meaning when the substrate is recognized as substantially water. The water in your body during sleep is the same water that was there during waking. The continuity of your biological existence across the gap of unconsciousness is, in part, the continuity of the water that constitutes you. The patterns in the water, the configurations of hydration shells around proteins, the specific chemistry of every cellular process, persist through the night and continue to support your existence even when conscious experience is absent. What this means for the religious and theological dimensions of human experience is profound, and it deserves attention proportional to its weight. The Christian theological tradition, in its sacrament of baptism, articulated a vision of water as the medium of spiritual rebirth. The framework treats the water of baptism as not merely symbolic but actually transformative, the substance through which the believer enters into the death and resurrection of Christ. When this framework is read alongside the biological recognition that water is the medium of biological birth and decomposition, the medium through which all transformations of living matter actually occur, the theological claim takes on a precision that its original articulation could not have anticipated. Every biological transformation in your existence has occurred in water. The development of your body in your mother's amniotic fluid was a water-mediated transformation. The decomposition of every meal you have ever eaten was a water-mediated process. The growth and healing and aging of your body has occurred, at every step, in water. The Christian sacramental claim that baptismal water is the medium of spiritual transformation participates, in its theological vocabulary, in the broader recognition that water is, in fact, the medium of every transformation that has ever occurred in your biological existence. The Hindu Vedantic recognition that the Ganga is the divine descended into terrestrial waters articulates a structurally parallel insight in different vocabulary. The water of the Ganga, in this framework, is the visible manifestation of divine activity in the world. The pilgrim who bathes in the Ganga is not just washing in chemical water. The pilgrim is participating in the contact between the human person and the divine reality that the water represents. When this framework is read alongside the biological recognition that the water in your body is constantly being exchanged with the water in your environment, that the water cycling through your kidneys today is the same water that has been cycling through other living beings and other natural systems across the entire history of the planet, the theological claim takes on its own kind of precision. The water in you is, in chemical fact, the same water that has been in countless other living beings and countless other natural processes. The pilgrim's contact with sacred water is a particular ritualized expression of the broader fact that all water on Earth is part of a single continuous substance that flows through every biological and geological process the planet contains. The Islamic recognition that God has made every living thing from water articulates the same insight in compressed form. The biological fact that life is constitutively aqueous is captured in the Quranic statement with a directness that anticipates, by 14 centuries, the modern scientific understanding. The Islamic ritual of wudu, the daily ablution that precedes prayer, places the practitioner in continuous contact with water as the medium of both physical and spiritual purification. The Zamzam water that is drunk by pilgrims to Mecca is part of the same global water cycle that supports all biological life. The theological framework treats this water as carrying particular spiritual significance, and the believer who drinks it is participating in the tradition that connects them to the broader Islamic understanding of how God's provision sustains existence. The Taoist analysis of water as the perfection of effective action articulates a complementary insight. The qualities of water that Lao Tzu identified, the adaptability, the persistence, the willingness to occupy the lowest places, the ability to wear away the hardest substances over time, are precisely the qualities that water exhibits in its biological role. The water in your body adapts to every cellular structure without imposing its own form. The water persists in cycling through your tissues despite the constant changes those tissues undergo. The water yields to every organic structure that contains it, while continuing to support the activity of those structures. The Taoist vision of water as the model for wise living and effective action is, when read alongside the biological understanding, a precise philosophical articulation of how water actually operates as the medium of life. The Jewish tradition's institution of the mikveh, the ritual immersion in living waters, articulates the same insight in liturgical practice. The believer who immerses in the mikveh is participating in the cosmic cycle of waters that the Hebrew Bible places at the foundation of creation. The phrase Mayim Hayim, living waters, captures in compressed form the recognition that the water of the mikveh is part of the same global water that has been moving through all biological and geological processes since the beginning of life on Earth. These traditions, taken together, converge on a practical orientation that bears on how to live in light of the recognitions we have been examining. The orientation is not exotic. The orientation involves a different relationship to the most ordinary substance in your life, the water that you drink and bathe in, and that constitutes more than half of your body. The traditions have all developed practices that involve water, and the practices have served, across thousands of years, as ways of bringing the recognition of water's significance into the lived experience of religious practitioners. The structural insight that emerges from comparing these practices with the modern scientific understanding is that water deserves a different kind of attention than ordinary use of water typically involves. There are particular practices that the contemplative traditions have developed for this kind of attention, and they are simpler than they might appear. The first is to attend to the water you drink. Most of us drink water without attention, often in distraction, often without recognizing the substance we are bringing into our bodies. The practice is to bring brief attention to this. When you drink a glass of water, consider for a moment what is happening. The water is becoming part of you. The molecules that were in the glass a moment ago are entering your bloodstream, distributing through your tissues, becoming the medium of every biological process you depend on. The water that constitutes you tomorrow includes the water you drink today. To attend to this, even briefly, is to enter into a different relationship with the most basic substance of your existence. A second practice is to notice the role of water in your daily activities. The water in the shower that washes you, the water in the food you eat, which is water-based at every level of preparation and consumption, the water in the air around you, in the form of humidity that affects your comfort and your breathing, the water in the natural environments you encounter, in rain, in rivers, in oceans, in the morning dew on grass. All of this is the same substance whose specific features make your existence possible. To notice this, occasionally during the day, allows the surface ego to register, even briefly, that you are continuously embedded in a global water cycle that is the foundation of all biological life. A third practice is to attend to the natural water sources that the world makes available. The traditions have all placed particular value on natural water, water from rivers and springs and rain rather than water that has been processed and packaged and divorced from its connection to the natural cycle. There are practical reasons for this, including the chemistry of natural water and the connection to the broader water cycle. There are also reflective reasons: to stand near a flowing river, to drink from a spring, to walk in the rain, to swim in the ocean, is to encounter water in conditions that allow its specific features to be more directly experienced than the conditions of bottled water or processed tap water typically provide. The traditions have valued this encounter for reasons that, when articulated in modern vocabulary, include both the chemistry of natural water and the experiential dimension of being in contact with the larger systems that water participates in. A fourth practice draws specifically from the convergence between the science and the traditions we have been examining. It is the practice of noticing occasionally during the day, that the water in your body is in continuous exchange with the water of the world. Your body releases water through breathing, through sweating, through the various processes that maintain water balance. Your body receives water through drinking, through eating, through the moisture in the air you breathe. The water that constitutes you is not a fixed quantity. It is a flow, a continuous exchange, a participation in a global cycle that includes every other living being and every body of water on the planet. To notice this, even briefly, is to register that the apparent boundary between you and the water of the world is, in chemical fact, more porous than ordinary intuition assumes. You are continuously taking in water that has been part of other beings, other ecosystems, other geographical regions. You are continuously releasing water that will become part of other beings, other ecosystems, other regions. The continuity is constant. The exchange never stops. And the recognition that this continuous exchange is what your existence consists of, at the most basic material level, is one of the more grounding recognitions a human being can experience. These practices are simple, but they accumulate. Practiced over time, they shift the relationship between the attending self and the substance that constitutes the self. The water becomes less a background resource and more an active participant in your existence. The attention to water becomes less an occasional practice and more a continuous awareness that water is what you are made of and what your life depends on. The shift is not dramatic in any single instance. The shift is the gradual deepening of relationship with the substance that has been with you, in you, around you, throughout every moment of your biological existence. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward. Not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed. A recognition that water is not just a chemical compound that supports your life as a passive medium. A recognition that water has specific properties that make complex biological existence possible, that the contemplative traditions noticed something true about water's significance long before science could measure it, and that the relationship between you and the water that constitutes you is the most fundamental material relationship of your existence. The body that reads these words is, by mass, more than half water. The brain that processes them is, by mass, even more water than the rest of the body, with the proportion in adult brain tissue being approximately 75%. The cellular processes that support consciousness, including the firing of neurons, the propagation of action potentials, the release and uptake of neurotransmitters, all occur in water. The very experience you are having of reading and understanding these words is, at the biological level, a water-mediated process. You are not just supported by water. You are, in significant measure, made of water. And the water that constitutes you is the same water whose properties have been the subject of these inquiries. This recognition, when it is allowed to settle, has implications that go beyond intellectual understanding. The water you drink today will become the water that constitutes you tomorrow. The food you eat is processed by water-mediated chemistry. The environments you inhabit are mediated by water in countless ways. To live with attention to this is to live with a different relationship to the most basic features of your existence than the unattentive default that most modern life encourages. The fear that ordinary perception carries about being separate from the world, about being a small, isolated being in a vast, indifferent universe, has, in the case of water, a specific and concrete refutation. You are not separate from the water of the world. You are, in chemical fact, a temporary configuration of the global water cycle. The water in your body today was, at various times in the past, in clouds, in rivers, in oceans, in the bodies of other living beings, in the soil of distant continents. The water in your body tomorrow will be released back into the global cycle, where it will continue to participate in the biology and geology of the planet long after the configuration that is currently you has dissolved. The continuity of water across all these states is not merely metaphor. The continuity is chemical fact, and the recognition that you are part of this continuity, rather than a separate thing temporarily borrowing water from the world, is one of the more grounding recognitions available to a human being. When you drink water tonight, consider for a moment what is happening. When you bathe, when you encounter natural water, when you notice the water in the air around you, attend briefly to the substance that is, at the deepest material level, what you are. The attention is small. The recognition that emerges from sustained attention over time is not small. The water that has been with you throughout your life, that constitutes the body that reads these words, that supports the consciousness that is reading them, is the same water that the contemplative traditions have placed at the center of their religious practice for thousands of years, and that modern science has now identified as the unique medium of biological complexity. The convergence between these recognitions is not a coincidence. The convergence is a feature of how water actually works in the world, recognized by both lines of inquiry through their entirely different methods. There is something almost dizzying about this recognition when it is allowed to land fully. The water in your blood right now was, at some earlier point, in a cloud, in an ocean, in the body of another living creature, in the soil of a forest, in the ice of a glacier, in the rain that fell during some specific storm in some specific place at some specific time in the past. It has been on a journey through the global water cycle for as long as the planet has had liquid water, which is to say, for billions of years. The specific configuration of water that constitutes you today is a temporary form that the cycle is currently taking. Tomorrow, the configuration will be slightly different. Years from now, it will be different again. Eventually, the configuration that is you will dissolve, and the water that was you will return to the cycle, where it will continue to participate in biological and geological processes long after the configuration that read these words has ceased to exist. The continuity of the water is not the continuity of you. The continuity of the water is the continuity of the substrate from which beings like you, temporary configurations of the global water, emerge and into which they eventually dissolve. This is not, despite how it might initially sound, a depressing recognition. It is rather a recognition that places you in a much larger context than the surface ego ordinarily registers. You are not a small, isolated being who happens to be drinking water from time to time. You are a temporary configuration of the same substance that fills every river and ocean, that falls as rain on every continent, that constitutes the bodies of every other living being. The water in you is part of the water of the world, in the most literal chemical sense. And when you attend to this, even briefly, the apparent isolation of being a separate individual gives way to a recognition that you are continuously participating in something much larger than yourself, in a way that does not depend on belief or theory, but on the simple chemistry of what your body is made of. The next time you drink a glass of water, you will be participating in something that has been going on continuously throughout the history of life on this planet. The molecules entering your body are part of the same global cycle that has been mediating biological existence for billions of years. The features of these molecules that make them suitable for life are the same features that the traditions noticed and the science has now confirmed. The recognition of what water is, what water has been, what water will continue to be, is available in the simplest of practices, the daily acts of drinking, of bathing, of noticing. You are made of water. The water is made of features whose specific configuration has been the subject of contemplative reflection across all the major religious traditions and of scientific investigation across centuries of empirical work. The convergence between these reflections and the modern understanding is striking. And what remains, when the convergence is taken seriously, is the question of how to live in light of what has been recognized. The question is not academic. The question is the most personal question available to a being whose existence is, at the deepest material level, the existence of water in a particular biological configuration. And the answer, when the recognition has had time to settle, is not anxiety about what you are made of, but a kind of grateful astonishment at the substance whose specific features have been holding you in being all along, present in every cell, in every breath, in every moment of conscious experience, as the medium through which existence itself becomes possible for beings like yourself.